Welcome back to another journey into the shadows. I'm your host, and tonight we're traveling to a place where fog never lifts and isolation becomes something far more sinister than solitude. Before we begin, if you enjoy stories that creep into your thoughts long after the lights go out, please consider subscribing and hitting that notification bell. Your support helps me bring you these tales from the darker corners of imagination. Tonight's story follows Unease, a writer seeking the perfect quiet retreat to finish his manuscript. He finds what appears to be an ideal sanctuary in old Victorian house at the end of a forgotten road, wrapped in perpetual mist. But some houses hunger for more than just occupancy. Some houses collect souls, so settle in, perhaps dim the lights, and let me tell you about the house on Briar's End. The fog had settled over the valley like a burial shroud when Unease first laid eyes on the house. It stood at the end of a narrow dirt road, flanked by skeletal oaks, whose branches seemed to reach toward the structure with arthritic fingers. The realtor had called it rustic charm, but as Unease stepped from his car, the only word that came to mind was forgotten. The house was a Victorian relic. 3 stories of weathered clapboard siding that had once been white, but now wore the gray patina of decades. Paint peeled from the window frames like dried skin, and the wraparound porch sagged under the weight of neglect. Yet something about its isolation appealed to him, the way it sat apart from the world, secretive and self-contained. Perfect for a writer, he murmured to himself, shouldering his duffel bag. The silence that followed his words felt too complete, as if the fog had swallowed them whole. The front door opened with a groan that seemed to echo through the empty rooms beyond. Unease stepped inside, his footsteps hollow on the hardwood floors. The interior smelled of dust and something else, something organic and faintly sweet, like flowers left too long in stagnant water. The layout was simple enough: a front parlor with a stone fireplace, a kitchen toward the back, and a staircase that curved upward into shadow. What struck him most was the wallpaper intricate pattern of vines and roses that seemed to shift in his peripheral vision, as if the flowers were slowly blooming and dying in an endless cycle. He set down his bag and walked to the front window. Through the glass, the fog pressed close, transforming the familiar world into something alien. The moving truck wouldn't arrive until tomorrow, which meant tonight he would sleep in an empty house with nothing but his thoughts for company. Perfect, he told himself. No distractions. Just me and the manuscript. But as he stood there, watching the fog coil and uncoil around the oak trees, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching him back. The first 3 days passed quietly enough. The moving truck arrived as scheduled, and Unease spent his time arranging furniture and settling into routines. He set up his office in what had once been a sunroom, its windows offering a panoramic view of the fog-shrouded landscape. When the mist cleared, which happened rarely, he could see rolling hills dotted with abandoned farmhouses, their windows dark as dead eyes. The house revealed its quirks gradually. The floorboards in the hallway creaked in a specific sequence, as if invisible feet were walking the same path over and over. The kitchen faucet dripped with metronomic persistence despite his attempts to tighten it. And sometimes, usually in the late afternoon when the light grew thin, he would catch movement in his peripheral vision, a shadow that shouldn't be there. A curtain stirring in a room with no windows open. He told himself these were normal settling sounds, the natural complaints of an old house adjusting to new occupancy. But when he sat at his typewriter in the evening, trying to work on his novel, the sounds seemed to organize themselves into patterns, like Morse code tapped out in wood and metal. It was on the 4th night that he discovered the locked room. He had been exploring the 2nd floor more thoroughly, measuring spaces and planning where to put his overflow of books. Most of the rooms were empty, their hardwood floors scuffed but solid, their windows offering views of the perpetual fog. But at the end of the hallway, he found a door that wouldn't open. The brass knob turned freely, but the door held fast, as if something heavy pressed against it from the other side. Ilias put his shoulder to it, then stepped back, frowning. The door looked identical to all the others, white-painted wood with panels and brass hardware. But unlike the others, this one had no keyhole. He made a mental note to ask the realtor about it when he called to report the broken faucet. But that night, as he lay in his makeshift bedroom on the first floor, he found himself thinking about the room. What was behind that door? Storage, a closet. Why would someone seal it shut? The house settled around him with its symphony of creaks and sighs. But tonight, the sounds seemed different, more purposeful, as if the building itself were trying to tell him something. And sometime after midnight, as he drifted between sleep and waking, he could have sworn he heard footsteps in the hallway above, slow, measured steps, back and forth, always stopping at the end of the hall, where the locked door waited. By the end of the first week, the small disturbances had become routine. Objects weren't quite where he'd left them, his coffee mug migrating from the kitchen counter to the windowsill, his reading glasses appearing on the mantelpiece when he was certain he'd left them by his typewriter. The logical part of his mind supplied explanations. He was still adjusting to the new space, misremembering where he'd put things, but the logical part of his mind had no explanation for what he saw in the bathroom. Mirror. It happened on a Tuesday morning while he was shaving. The mirror was old, its silver backing spotted with black marks that created a constellation of imperfections across the glass. As he drew the razor across his jaw, he noticed something in the reflection that made him pause. There was someone standing behind him. Elias spun around, foam still clinging to half his face. The bathroom was empty. He turned back to the mirror, and his reflection stared back at him alone, confused. A line of shaving cream like a scar across his cheek. He finished shaving with unsteady hands, telling himself it had been a trick of the spotted mirror, a convergence of flaws that had suggested a human shape. But when he looked closely at the glass, he could see the outline clearly, a tall figure with indistinct features, standing just behind and to the left of where his own reflection appeared. The figure wasn't there when he looked directly at it. Only in the reflection, only in the mirror. That afternoon, while trying to work on his manuscript, Ilias found himself thinking about mirrors and reflections, about the way old glass could play tricks on the eye. But his thoughts kept circling back to the locked room, upstairs. He had called the realtor twice now, leaving messages that hadn't been returned. The broken faucet continued its steady drip, marking time like a patient metronome. As the sun began to set, though, it was difficult to tell through the perpetual fog. Ilias climbed the stairs to the second floor. The hallway stretched before him, longer than he remembered, the wallpaper's pattern of roses seeming to writhe in the dim light. At the far end, the locked door waited. He approached it slowly, his footsteps muffled by the threadbare carpet runner. When he reached the door, he pressed his ear against the wood and listened. Silence, but not the empty silence of an unused room. This was the heavy quiet of held breath, of someone on the other side waiting for him to go away. Ilias tried the knob again. It turned easily, but the door remained sealed. He examined the frame more carefully and noticed something he'd missed before. The wood around the edges was smooth, as if the door had been painted shut from the inside. From the inside, the implication sent a chill down his spine. Who would seal themselves into a room, and why? That night, the footsteps returned, but this time, they weren't alone. The voices started as whispers. Ilias woke to the sound around 3 in the morning, that dead hour when the world feels most fragile. At first, he thought it was the wind moving through the eaves, but as he lay still and listened, the sounds resolved into something unmistakably human. Conversation, low, urgent murmurs coming from the floor above. He slipped from bed and crept to the staircase, his bare feet silent on the cold hardwood. The voices grew clearer as he climbed, though he couldn't make out individual words. There were at least 2 speakers, maybe 3, engaged in what sounded like an argument. The hallway was empty when he reached the second floor, but the voices continued. They seemed to be coming from behind the locked door. Elias approached carefully, his heart hammering against his ribs. The murmurs were clearer now, though still indistinct, like voices heard through water. He pressed his ear to the door and held his breath. Shouldn't have come too late now. He can hear us. The voices stopped abruptly, as if a radio had been switched off. Elias waited, not daring to breathe, but the silence stretched on. Finally, he whispered, "Hello?" The temperature in the hallway dropped 10 degrees in an instant. His breath misted in the suddenly frigid air, and frost began to form on the door handle beneath his hand. From somewhere deep in the house came a sound like settling timber, but louder and more deliberate, as if the building itself were shifting. Rearranging its bones. Elias backed away from the door, his skin prickling with more than cold. As he reached the top of the stairs, he heard something that stopped him dead. His own voice, muffled by the door, calling out from inside the locked room. "Hello? Is someone there?" Sleep became elusive after that night. Elias would lie in bed, listening to the house's nocturnal symphony, wondering what was real and what his isolation was conjuring from the shadows. He had been alone for barely 2 weeks, but already the silence felt oppressive, like a weight pressing down on his thoughts. He tried to focus on his writing, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, he found himself drawn to research, digging through county records and historical societies, trying to learn more about the house and its previous inhabitants. What he discovered only deepened his unease. The house had been built in 1897 by a man named Theodore Ashworth, a minor industrialist who had made his fortune in textile mills. Ashworth had lived there with his wife and young daughter until 1903, when tragedy struck. The records were sparse, but newspaper accounts spoke of a domestic incident that had left Mrs. Ashworth dead and her husband mentally unstable. He had been committed to an asylum, where he died 3 years later. But it was the daughter that troubled Elias most. 8-year-old Margaret Ashworth had simply vanished. The authorities had searched the house and grounds extensively, but no trace of her was ever found. The newspaper speculation ranged from kidnapping to the possibility that she had witnessed her mother's death and fled into the wilderness, where she had perished from exposure. The house had changed hands several times over the decades, but no family had stayed long. The pattern was always the same. New owners would move in with optimism, only to leave within months, citing atmospheric disturbances, or simply claiming the house was unsuitable for habitation. Elias was the first person to live there alone. That night, as he sat in his makeshift office trying to make sense of what he'd learned, the house began to change around him. It started with the wallpaper. The roses in the pattern seemed to be moving more obviously now, blooming and withering in accelerated cycles. When he looked directly at them, they were still, but in his peripheral vision, the walls themselves seemed alive, breathing with vegetative pulse. The sounds were different too. Instead of the random creaks and sighs he'd grown accustomed to, the house now groaned with purpose, as if invisible hands were opening and closing doors throughout the structure. Footsteps echoed in empty rooms, and somewhere in the distance, he could hear what sounded like a child crying. But it was the smell that finally drove him from his chair. The sweet, organic odor he'd noticed on his first day had been growing stronger, and now it filled the air with cloying intensity. It wasn't flowers, he realized. It was the smell of decay, something that had been beautiful once, but had been left to rot in darkness. Elias stood on unsteady legs and walked to the front window. The fog pressed against the glass like a living thing, and for a moment, he thought he saw faces in its gray coils and distinct features that formed and dissolved before he could focus on them behind him. The house continued its nocturnal performance, but now there was a new sound, one that made his blood freeze, the slow, deliberate turning of a doorknob. He spun around, expecting to see an intruder, but the room was empty. The sound came again, clearer now, followed by the squeal of hinges that hadn't been oiled in decades. The sounds were coming from upstairs, from the locked room. Elias climbed the stairs like a man walking to his execution. Each step seemed to take an eternity, and the sounds from above grew clearer with every footfall. Not just the door opening, there were voices now. Multiple conversations, overlapping in a cacophony of whispers and sighs. The hallway was darker than usual, the overhead light flickering with electrical distress. But at the far end, a warm yellow glow spilled from beneath the door that had been locked for decades. The door that now stood slightly ajar. Ilias approached slowly, his hand trailing along the wall for support. The wallpaper felt warm and damp beneath his fingers, as if the roses were sweating in the artificial light. The voices grew clearer as he drew closer, resolving into distinct conversations. Waited so long, finally someone to listen. He's almost here. The light from beneath the door pulsed like a heartbeat, and now Ilias could smell something new beneath the pervasive odor of decay. Candle wax, old wood, the musty scent of rooms long sealed. He reached the door and hesitated, his hand hovering over the handle. Through the gap, he could see movement shadows dancing on walls, the suggestion of figures moving in lamplight. And underneath it all, the sound of a child sobbing quietly, hopelessly. Elias pushed the door open. The room beyond was impossible. It was larger than the house should have allowed, stretching back into shadows that seemed to go on forever. The walls were covered in the same rose-patterned wallpaper, but here the flowers were in constant motion, blooming and dying in endless cycles that created a hypnotic, nauseating display. Candles flickered on every surface: the mantelpiece, the window sills, a large oak table in the center of the room, casting dancing shadows that seemed to move independently of their flames. But it was the occupants that made Ilias's sanity real. They sat around the table like dinner guests at some macabre feast, men and women in clothing from different eras, their faces pale and indistinct in the candlelight. Some wore the formal dress of the Victorian era, others the simpler garments of farmers and laborers. They were all talking at once, their voices creating the whispered cacophony he'd been hearing. But their words seemed to come from very far away. At the head of the table sat a man in a burgundy waistcoat, his dark hair slicked back with pomade. Theodore Ashworth, Ilias realized with dreamlike certainty. The man's eyes were wild, unfocused, and his hands moved constantly as he spoke to invisible companions. But it was the small figure hunched in the corner that drew Ilias's attention and held it with iron grip. A little girl in a white nightgown sat on the floor, her back against the wall, her face buried in her knees. Her dark hair fell around her like a curtain, and her shoulders shook with silent sobs. As Ilias watched, she slowly raised her head and looked directly at him. Her eyes were holes, not empty sockets, but actual holes that seemed to go back and back into infinite darkness. When she opened her mouth to speak, the same darkness spilled out like liquid shadow. "You shouldn't have come here," she said, in a voice like autumn leaves scraping across stone. "Now, you can never leave." The candles guttered and went out, plunging the impossible room into absolute darkness. But in that darkness, Ilias could still see them, the dinner guests. The mad father, the hollow-eyed child, glowing with their own pale, sickly light. And he understood, with the terrible clarity that comes in dreams, that they had all been waiting for him. Every previous occupant of the house, every soul who had been touched by its malevolent influence, gathered in this room that existed outside of space and time. The room that had been sealed not to keep something out, but to keep everything in. "Welcome home," Theodore Ashworth said, his voice echoing from everywhere and nowhere at once. "We've been expecting you." Ilias tried to run, but his legs moved through air thick as honey. The doorway he'd entered through was gone, replaced by more wallpaper, more roses blooming and dying in their eternal cycle. The assembled figures rose from their chairs with movements like marionettes operated by a drunken puppeteer, their pale faces turning toward him with expressions of terrible hunger. "Don't be afraid," the little girl said, standing now, her empty eye sockets fixed on his face. "It doesn't hurt for very long." But Ilias was beyond fear now. Some deeper part of his mind, the part that had always known this moment would come, accepted what was happening with startling calm. He had been drawn to this house for a reason. The isolation, the atmosphere, the perfect setting for a writer. It had all been orchestrated. A trap set by forces he couldn't begin to understand. The figures began to close in, their movements accompanied by the sound of settling wood and shifting foundation stones. The house itself was participating in whatever ritual was about to unfold, and Ilias realized that the building was more than just a structure. It was a vessel, a container for souls that had never been allowed to rest. "Why?" he asked, surprised by the steadiness of his own voice. Theodore Ashworth paused in his approach, his wild eyes focusing for the first time. "Why?" He laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "Because the dead require company, my dear fellow. Because loneliness is a weight too heavy for any soul to bear alone. I killed my wife," he continued conversationally, as if discussing the weather, a moment of rage, "you understand. But my daughter, sweet Margaret, she saw it all. Couldn't have that, could I? Couldn't have her telling tales." The little girl's hollow sockets seemed to weep shadows. "He put me behind the wall," she whispered. "Put me there and sealed me in. I listened to him go mad, listened to him talk to Mama's ghost, until they took him away. But I came back," Ashworth said, his grin stretching impossibly wide. "Death couldn't keep me from my home. And Margaret, dear Margaret, she was still here, still waiting, still crying behind the wall." The other figures pressed closer, and now Ilias could see that they weren't all from the same era. Clothes from the 1920s, the 1940s, the 1960s, decades of people who had been drawn to this house, drawn to whatever waited in the locked room. "Every generation," Ashworth explained, his voice growing distant and hollow. "Someone comes. Someone seeking solitude, seeking isolation. They hear our voices, feel our presence, and eventually they open the door, and then they join us," the little girl finished. "Forever and ever and ever." The walls began to close in, the impossible room contracting like a heart in reverse. The roses on the wallpaper bloomed furiously now, their petals falling like tears, like blood, like the last hopes of the damned. Ilias closed his eyes and thought of his unfinished manuscript, his abandoned life, all the words he would never write. When he opened them again, the figures were inches away, their pale hands reaching for him with fingers like winter branches. "Welcome to the family," Theodore Ashworth whispered, and the room collapsed into darkness. Epilogue. Fog lifted on the morning they found the house empty. The real estate agent a different one this time, the previous agent having suffered what the doctors called a nervous episode, stood in the front parlor with the county sheriff, surveying the abandoned furniture and personal effects. "Strangest thing," the sheriff was saying, turning Ilias's manuscript pages with careful fingers. "Car's still here, all his stuff, but no sign of him anywhere, like he just ... disappeared." The agent nodded absently, her attention focused on the wallpaper. The roses seemed particularly vibrant today, their colors rich and deep, almost as if they were alive. "We'll keep the case open, of course," the sheriff continued. "But between you and me, this house has a history. People don't tend to stay long." "I'm aware of the history," the agent replied coolly. "That's why we're pricing it so aggressively. There's always someone looking for a quiet place to write, or paint, or just get away from the world." As they walked toward the front door, neither of them noticed the faint sound coming from upstairs, a new voice added to the eternal conversation, asking the same questions that had been asked for decades. Why won't the door open? Is anyone there? Please, someone help me. ... The fog began to roll back in as the sheriff's car disappeared down the dirt road. By evening, the house stood alone again, patient and waiting. The for sale sign creaked gently in the wind, and somewhere in the distance, a typewriter began to click with slow, deliberate keystrokes, writing the same story over and over. The story of the next soul who would be drawn to the house on Briar's End, in the locked room that was no longer locked. In the space between spaces where time held no meaning, the dinner party continued, and at the table now sat a new guest, his face pale in the candlelight, his eyes slowly learning to see in the darkness that had claimed them all. Ilias had found his story at last, and like all the best stories, it would never end. And so ends our tale of Ilias and the house that refused to let him leave. The fog still rolls across that forgotten valley, and somewhere in the mist, a for sale sign creaks in the wind, waiting for the next soul-seeking solitude. I hope this story found its way into that quiet corner of your mind where the best horror stories take root. If it did, I'd be grateful if you'd give this video a like. It truly helps more people discover these dark tales we share together. And if you're hungry for more stories that blur the line between reality and nightmare, please subscribe and ring that notification bell. There are so many more shadows to explore, so many more whispers in the dark waiting to be heard. Consider sharing this story with someone who appreciates a good chill down their spine. After all, the best horror stories are meant to be shared, passed along like whispered secrets in the night. Until next time, keep the lights on, ... or don't. Sometimes the darkness reveals truths we never expected to find. Sweet dreams.